Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'd like to adjourn the Striped Bass Management Board. I am Mike Armstrong, your new chair. Thank you for that great honor for the next 2 years. You may want to hold that applause for, I'd say, 2 years or so. Did I just adjourn it? That's awesome. We're all done. Thank you. So, all right. First order of business, the approval of the agenda. Any additions, revisions? Seeing none, moving on to approve the proceedings from October 2017. Changes, comments? Okay, that is approved unanimously. Bring us to public comment. I have a couple people on the list. Anyone else who would like to provide public comment can, even though you're not on the list, concerning a topic that we're not discussing today, but concerns striped bass. Could I have Ken Hashings?
Good afternoon. My name is Ken Hastings. I'm a recreational fisherman from Maryland. And I noticed in looking over the agendas for this meeting this week that the policy board tomorrow is going to discuss some interesting topics relative to uncertainty and specifically for recreational fishing harvests. I've always been amazed and sometimes somewhat frustrated at the casual way, in my view, that uncertainty has been handled by this commission when talking about striped bass. At one point, I remember a staffer saying that in this business, even the uncertainty was uncertain. And I took that home with me and slept on it for a while, and it never got any better. But I'm happy to see that the commission, in filling out this survey for the policy board, is highlighting these problems. I'm looking forward to less uncertainty in the future relative to striped bass. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Look forward to a good meeting tomorrow on uncertainty. Next, we have Captain Robert Newberg.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Captain Robert Newberry, Chairman Delmarva Fisheries Association. The question, I have a comment that's kind of based around a question. 4 years ago, we went into a situation where we took a 20% reduction on our commercial fishery and also the equivalence on our recreational. And we were told by our department at that time and other individuals that we would be getting this back after 2 years. The question and the comment, I said, I think it's about time we got those back. And when can anybody answer me on the commission when we might possibly get the 20% return and back to our initial size of the fish?
Nicole, could you address, or Max, we have Amendment 4 in place, and that will continue until it's changed.
Yeah, thanks. Addendum 4 will remain in place until further action is taken.
And that will be set by when they do the stock assessment, correct?
That seems to be the current timeline.
All right, thank you.
Okay, which brings us to agenda item 4, to review and consider the Maryland Conservation Equivalency Proposal, and this will be a final action item. So I'd first like to have Mike speak to the proposal, tell us why and the details, and okay, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a feeling I'm going to have to get awfully comfortable behind the mic here over the next hour. But I do appreciate the opportunity to address the board kind of outside the standard, which would be that the technical committee, the AP, the LAC report out to us. And the reason why I asked to do that and worked with staff on presenting to you in this way was that I really wanted to emphasize to all of you that the proposal that we've put together that we're going to take a look at and hopefully make a decision on by the end of the day, it's a proposal that addresses a really serious problem that we have in our state right now, which is mortality and waste that's associated with discards. This is even exacerbated to some degree through the summertime, fall, summer fishery, when anglers are using bait, chumming, and live lining. And in some cases, even what we're seeing is that there's an increased use of treble hooks in order to catch fish, which, you know, as we all know, it's even worse than a J hook as far as gut hooking the fish. So, you know, the number of released fish we had in our state sharply increased as a result of the changes that we made when we implemented within the recreational fishery Addendum 4. We increased the size limit from 18 to 20 inches and kind of left everything else on the table as far as the consistency that we had for many, many years. After our attempt, and you know, we discussed with the board and we had initial approval of Addendum 5, which would have offered for a liberalization to all states, both commercial and recreational. There was a 10% liberalization being discussed, and that didn't go anywhere, and that's what puts us here today. So one of the things I wanted to bring to everybody's attention was that this is not Maryland's, it is not our interest to continue on the path of Addendum 5, which we would see as a liberalization and additional mortality on top of what we currently have in place. This is a conservation equivalency proposal. And you know, we made a commitment to our stakeholders to address this ongoing and really severe problem that we have, and this proposal, I think, gets us to that. Now, as with everything that we do, things change. Ideas that are generated throughout the process alter the path that you may have started down. And to clarify, for simplicity, Max has put together what we had presented to the technical committee as far as all the different options that we were exploring with our stakeholders. And so what you see before you on the board addresses what our current status quo is. Current status quo is a May 16th to December 20th season with a 2-fish bag limit and a minimum of 20 inches, and with only 1 fish being greater than 28. We are proposing to get the minimum size down to 19, and we explored a number of, this is only a portion of what we explored regarding different ways we could try to address this problem of mortality. So the idea here was that we would have a minimum size of 19 inches for some portion of the year and then revert back to the 20 inches. Everything with the exception of the first option did just that. We would have both a 19 and a 20-inch limit for different portions of the year. And through our discussions with stakeholders, we were getting advice that, you know, closing the month of December was not a viable alternative for us. And not only that, but we made a commitment when we began this process not to bring before the board options that increased total removals. If you look at the last 2 or 3 options there at the bottom of the table, under the different percent removals, those options would increase the total removals by between 2 and 6%. And we didn't believe those to be something that we wanted to have that conversation with the board. So, Max, can you go to the next slide? So, we have removed those from any additional consideration. And so, that leads me to the last 2 options, which have the December closure. And in communications with our stakeholders, both private anglers and charter boat captains, those are not going to work for us either. So that takes us down to 1 remaining viable option. And I wanted to bring this before you at this time so that we don't get wrapped up and confused in all the other options in the proposal when we begin the conversation after the reports. So, Max, I don't know if you have one last slide. This last slide would be what it would be. This is the option that we were pursuing, and we're looking for the board's support. We can talk about the details of it a little bit later, but Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for allowing me to there's been a lot going on, a lot of conversations and discussion over this, so I wanted to bring everybody up to speed on where Maryland currently stands and what the expectation for the rest of the meeting would be as far as what options we would be looking to approve. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll go to the technical committee review. So all these options were submitted to the technical committee. What I'm going to have them do is review the general way they looked at all of them in case there are options to mix and match things that is not on the table for the Maryland proposal, just so we know what we're dealing with.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I'll be presenting the TC report on the conservation equivalency proposal submitted by Maryland that was just reviewed briefly for their 2018 recreational management measures. I'm going to start off by briefly touching on the conservation equivalency language that's contained in Addendum 4. Then I'll touch briefly on the Maryland proposal, but we just got a really nice overview of that, so I won't spend too much time on it. And finally, I'll review the comments provided by the technical committee. The language written in Addendum 4 that pertains to conservation equivalency states, Amendment 6, Section 4.6, allows for states to submit alternative regulations that are conservationally equivalent to regulations approved in this document for board review and approval. However, Addendum 4 did not approve a set of regulations for the Chesapeake Bay. Addendum 4 specifically states the Chesapeake Bay jurisdictions will submit a management program that achieves at least a 20.5% reduction from 2012 harvest, including estimated dead discards, in the Chesapeake Bay recreational fishery for technical committee review and board approval. As a result, the technical committee had some difficulty as it was unclear to the TC how to interpret conservation equivalency under Addendum 4. The Maryland Conservation Equivalency Proposal puts forward a number of alternative management measures to be implemented in 2018 with the primary goal of reducing dead discards. All options propose a reduced size limit of 19 inches during all or part of the summer and fall months. By reducing the minimum size from 20 inches to 19 inches during that time, direct harvest will increase, but dead discards would decrease. The estimated change in total removals relative to current levels ranges from a 1% decrease to a 6% increase. The TC had several comments on the proposal. In general, the TC concluded that the data sources and methodologies used in the proposal are appropriate, with the exception of option B that includes the mandatory use of circle hooks. The TC supports the implementation of circle hook requirements to improve post-release survival rates, but does not endorse such requirements for conservation equivalency proposals at this time due to uncertainty in realized mortality reductions due to angler response and other variables, such as challenges of enforceability. The proposal demonstrates that the proposed measures, excluding option B, may have minimal impact on total removals relative to current regulations. However, the typical caveats regarding size limit analysis would still apply here, such as angler behavior changes and population size structure changes. The 2011 year class has also been a factor in recent years, and the 2014 year class will also likely be a factor in the coming years. Some additional comments from the TC are that the proposal did not follow all of the CE criteria set by the technical committee as outlined in the 2 memos supplied. Specifically, a longer time series of data was used, 2000 to 2014, which did not include the most recent 3 years. Additional info is also needed on the specific type of circle hook that would be required and which anglers the circle hook provision would apply to. Although the proposal did not have a specific analysis to demonstrate a 20.5% reduction relative to 2012, implementation of options A, G, and H are likely to result in minimal change from current levels. thus being conservationally equivalent to current regulations, but not the measures stipulated in Addendum 4. Interpretation of whether this proposal meets the letter or spirit of the conservation equivalency policy is a decision for the board. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Any questions for Nicole? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if this is a question for Nicole or Mike, but can we put the slide up with option B? So the circle hook requirement, option B, assuming a 9% discard mortality rate, there's no increase in removals. But under 25 or 27%, it says not applicable. I would just assume that if the discard rate is higher, which there's reason to believe that it is, given where that fishery occurs and the gear that's used, would we expect to see a negative value there? I'm wondering why it's left out. And I have a second question after that one's answered.
So that specific option was left out because they didn't provide the analysis in the proposal on it?
Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you are correct, John, in that if we would have run the same analysis under a 27% mortality, it would have been a negative number. Going into this analysis, we had some uncertainty about what the technical committee, how they would view the 27% based on the information that we used to generate that value in the analysis. So knowing that there would be a greater level of support for the 9%, given that it's the standard in the assessment, we left it where it is. But I think we can all look at that and understand that the savings could be much greater if. And I'm saying that we know for certain that the mortality is higher in certain times of the year.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for that answer, Mike. My second question was about the time series used, because that was flagged in the presentation. Was there a reason more recent years weren't used?
We used the 14-year time series, given that for all 14 years we had consistent regulations, and so the analysis was a little different from the standard. Let's take a look at the last 3 years and try to project forward. We used an analysis that looked back in time, and what we basically said was, had we had a 20-inch limit during all of those years, what would the projected discards and harvest had been, and then we went back from there in order to get us close to that equivalency. So it was just a different technique.
David?
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that question, I was going to ask that as my first question, but the second question is, if the analysis were rerun with the Addendum 4 timeline in it, how does that change the result?
We were not provided with the analysis, so we can't comment on that. I don't believe that Maryland has supplied that.
Mike?
Okay, so I didn't do the analysis, but thinking about the data used, we did an averaging over those 14 years to account for the variability and change that would have resulted from length frequencies for each year, and what fewer or less fish, more or less fish would have been available to us had our rules been different during those 14 years. So the averaging accounted for all that variability. I would expect that had we only used a couple years, there would have just been more variability. There would have been more error in the estimate that would have come forth. But that was not something we explored.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe what I read in the Maryland's proposal, it talked about the 2015 year class being the one that's really strong, and that's going to be coming on. But in the slide, I think it was pointed out it was a 2014 year class. Can you confirm if that's accurate? Thank you.
So it was 2015 was a high year of recruitment, and so that translates into a 2014 year class.
Doug, and then Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mike, we had some conversations, but that I wanted to bring forward to the board and ask you these questions. In the mandatory circle hook proposal, the analysis says that you made certain assumptions which are not specified in the proposals. And so I was wondering if you could provide answer to these two questions. What's in the assumptions, what was the percentage of anglers, recreational anglers and charter boat anglers that you assume are using bait versus other type of terminal tackle? And was there, you've had the circle hook study that you implemented and had some very good analysis done about the benefits of circle hooks, 15 or more years ago. And I know up on your website, you've certainly been encouraging the use of circle hooks. So my question is, do you have, or could you get a feel of how many people are already using circle hooks in this, in Maryland? And if that was part of the assumption.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions, Doug. The answer to your first question, we use a 75 to 25% ratio during the wave 3 and 4 period for bait versus the artificials. And I apologize, but I'm looking out to folks from my staff in the audience that are helping me with this one. The second, so you're talking more about a baseline of what we're starting with as far as circle hook use, and that is not something that we were able to estimate. It was not part of this equation.
So you assume that nobody was using circle hooks at all in the analysis?
I don't think that would have been a fair assumption. We know that circle hook use is happening. We're trying to characterize the increase in use through our determination of that ratio. We're trying to, we took a look at how we would maximize the use up to a 75% use during that time. That's assuming 100% bait users are using circle hooks. There are other people who don't use bait. They're using artificials throughout all times of the year.
Go ahead, Doug.
What I'm asking, in the analysis, you assumed that 75% of the people were using bait, and there's a mortality associated with that as long as they're not using circle hooks. But in the analysis, did you assume that of the people who are using bait, were any of those using circle hooks? Without having a figure there, I would have to assume that you just assumed that everybody was using J hooks or treble hooks or whatever.
That'd be right.
Richie, then Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm still trying to understand the conservation equivalency in relation to Addendum 4. So, so even though regulations were not part, because regulations in the Bay were not set, that those aren't part of conservation equivalency, the mortality, the 20% drop in mortality is part of Addendum 4. So if this is 0% and the Bay did not accomplish 20% reduction in mortality, then, you know, how is that conservation equivalent? I'm trying to understand how you make the leap from, you know, if they weren't reaching their goal and they're staying even with that or the same as that, how is that equivalent to Addendum 4?
Richie, I think that's part of the crux of this argument, so I'm going to shove it off till after we go through the law enforcement also, but we'll come back to it very importantly.
But isn't that a technical committee question? It's not.
No, they've already stated they will not offer an opinion on that. So it's a board decision. Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just a quick question for Mike. And Mike, I apologize if this was in the proposal and I'm just failing to see it. But in terms of circle hook use, there's non-offset circle hooks, there's offset circle hooks. Have you all determined what type of circle hook requirement you would have? Would it be, you know, non-offset, non-stainless circle hooks? And then I guess maybe the second piece of that is Doug mentioned information on your website encouraging the use of circle hooks, and I was wondering if you all had any other plans with regard to sort of public outreach and education should this proposal move forward. Thanks.
Yes, Mike.
Okay, thanks for the questions, Michelle. So we would go through a regulatory process to identifying that circle hook, and the circle hook would be a non-offset circle hook. We currently have rules in place in Maryland, and this is a good point to bring this up. We have circle hook requirements for intentional striped bass fishing in the pre-season prior to the trophy season that happens in the third week of April when that begins. So we've defined that circle hook as one for which it's offset, and a J hook can't be used in those waters if its point to shank length is greater than 1/2 inch. So we would go through the process if we were to be approved here. We wouldn't deviate from the non-offset. That's going to be that's the condition that we would use. That's the basis of the analysis that we use to get to where we are. But we would need to have those conversations with stakeholders and internally determine what that smaller hook size could still be for use of J hooks, because we have a white perch, a croaker, and a spot fishery, and those top bottom rig fishermen that are using little pieces of bloodworm. The intention is not to affect them to the degree that they wouldn't be able to harvest either. So that would all be in process if we were to be approved. That, I think, got both your questions. No?
Just additional public outreach and education efforts. I didn't know if you all had discussed that.
Yeah, absolutely. We would do everything we could within the agency to promote the use, to get the information out there. We've also had tremendous support from groups like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and Coastal Conservation Association and other angling organizations that we would look to help get the best, the most information we could out to the public. We have, and the season doesn't start until the middle of May, so we would undergo that process along with our regulatory process, which we'd have to still complete.
I have Rob, Adam, then Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mike. I've got a couple questions here. Do you happen to know which size is recruiting to the fishery? So it used to be rule of thumb that for an 18-inch size limit, about 25% at age 3 can recruit to the fishery. We're looking now at the difference between 20 inches and 19 inches. And I would think that it's really going to be, if the 2015 year class is the one that has some promise, right? So it looks like it's going to be effective in 2019, more so in 2018 as far as the discards go, or vice versa. Can you comment on that? And then I have one follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so to your question, Rob, the 2015 year class, with conversations I've had with folks at the agency, some will recruit to the 19-inch size limit, but it will be a small proportion. But in my opinion, those undersized fish are still going to be interacted with. And, you know, they're at that point where they're going to school and they're going to be with other 19 and 20-inch fish. And the intention here is to take a proactive approach and actively initiate regulatory change that's going to help protect those fish to the extent we can before they become harvestable.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So in looking at the Maryland releases and harvest, pretty clear that after about 2007, you know, the Maryland harvest did come to a little lower plateau, as did the discards. And then in 2015 and 16, discards, the B2s, not the dead discards, but the B2s are up a lot. So what I'm looking at is those are the time periods. So 2015 and 16, switch that now to maybe 2018-19 or 2019-20. That's where it looks like there's going to be some discard problems. If that year class is, you know, above average, which I assume that's the case, it's above average, and that's the really time period to look for. So, you know, I don't see this as a 2018 situation. I see this as having probably benefits into the couple of years after that, even more so. So, you know, I have that part here that I looked at, and then Virginia follows the same trend on harvest and discards, but at a lower level. So, you know, it's definitely something that is, you know, systematic in the Chesapeake Bay. So thank you for the time.
So, Rob, to your point, I would say that while we are looking at the implementation of this for 2018, I think the expectation would be that we'd be able to come back to this board and show the board that we have done what we've said we were going to do regarding enforcement and compliance, and we'd hope that the board would continue to support this effort. So while it may not have the greatest impact initially, when those 2017s, I'm sorry, when the 20 in 2019, we would hope that we would be able to maintain these regulations in moving forward. It's not the expectation that this is just a one-year deal.
So Adam, Pat, and Doug, we're getting a little into the weeds now. I think what I prefer to do, and it may be helpful to listen to the AP and the law enforcement first, and then come back to the details if a motion is made, okay? Okay, because I don't want to lose momentum and then move on and then try and come back, okay? If you can hold your questions. So at this point, Mark Robson, could you give the law enforcement report?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Law Enforcement Committee was able to meet by teleconference on January 8th and reviewed the various options for this conservation equivalency proposal. And we had 15 members of the Law Enforcement Committee participating. And so we offer these couple of comments specific to the proposal to reduce the size limit for the summer-fall season in the Bay. Generally, there were no specific objections to the Maryland proposals for this reduced size limit. We heard information from Maryland and from surrounding states regarding other fisheries and similar situations. The members of the LEC do, as usual, caution that to the extent possible, whenever you look at these conservation equivalency proposals, to keep an eye towards consistency between contiguous states or states that are sharing water bodies. It's something that we've commented on in previous conservation equivalency discussions, particularly for striped bass, and I think the Law Enforcement Committee would continue to press that point that even though you may want to alter size or bag limits, try to look wherever you can for consistency among jurisdictional regulations in those water bodies. Regarding the use of circle hooks, again, the Law Enforcement Committee would not have any real specific objections to circle hooks. Certainly, I think they all understand the potential conservation value of the use of such gear, but they do urge caution that managers and scientists shouldn't place too much reliance on strict enforcement of the use of circle hooks as a way of meeting your conservation or your harvest reduction goals. Certainly to the extent that even in law enforcement where outreach or education can be used, and as has been mentioned here, in this particular case, if there's going to be a high level of angler compliance with the use of circle hooks, certainly you could achieve your goals. But it's a difficult enforcement issue when you're looking at officers on the water at the docks trying to enforce a very specific gear use regulation for a specific species without really being able to address flagrant violation of that use of gear. And so they just urge caution that you don't rely too much on strict enforcement to meet those goals for harvest reduction. Obviously, the use of circle hooks is going to be something that and even in law enforcement would help to participate in dealing with the education and outreach component. Those were the two issues that we really focused on in our discussions, and that was the extent of our deliberations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mark. Any questions for Mark? Seeing none, Max, could you give the AP report, please?
Thank you, Chairman. So I'll be presenting the advisory panel report on behalf of the AP. The AP met via teleconference on January 12th of this year. Their goal of that call was to review Maryland's conservation equivalency proposal. They also were able to review the TC and LEC comments and then to draft their own comments for board consideration. And up on the screen is a list of the members that were in attendance. So the AP was sympathetic to the fact that there is a real problem in the Chesapeake Bay with dead discards. It's the AP's understanding that there is a large presence of sublegal fish in the bay, which makes it difficult to avoid high discard rates. And because of this underlying tone of the proposal, majority of the AP's discussion really focused on that mandatory circle hook requirement to improve post-release survival and reduce dead discards. The AP feels strongly that circle hooks provide a true conservation benefit and that all striped bass fisheries, not just within the Chesapeake Bay, should implement a mandatory circle hook requirement. Although not a part of the proposal, the AP did add several times that the use of treble hooks should actually be banned as well. Some AP members did express concerns regarding the precedence of approving the implementation of a mandatory circle hook requirement to achieve conservation equivalency, but overall, the views of the AP is that they believe the conservation benefits outweigh those concerns. So regarding AP recommendations, the AP supports option B, 19-inch minimum size limit from May 16th to December 15th with a mandatory circle hook requirement. However, the AP stressed that the requirement must be clearly defined. They went on to state that the realized conservation benefit is heavily dependent on the type of circle hook required. Some suggestions came from the AP for a non-offset circle hook, and the notion that larger hooks are generally associated with a higher post-release survival, the thought being that the larger the circle hook, the less likely to be ingested. I have one last note before I conclude this brief presentation. An AP member, Mr. Paquette, he represents Massachusetts, submitted comments after the AP call and after reviewing the draft AP report. You know, typically when that happens, the individual is asked to address the board as a member of the public or is to submit his comments separately. But since Mr. Paquette was unable to participate due to unforeseen circumstances, it was decided to include his comments as an appendix to the AP report instead of having him address this board or submit his comments separately. In a nutshell, Mr. Paquette's comments echoed the AP's comments regarding the high level of discards in the bay and that the circle hook requirement could help reduce, could help with that issue. However, regarding AP recommendations, Mr. Paquette is opposed to the CE proposal overall, stating that inconsistent terminology within the tackle industry and uncertainties regarding angler behavior are real challenges that shouldn't be overlooked. You know, again, I really want to just make it clear that the AP did not have a chance to hear these comments, respond to these comments, address these comments in their discussion, and that they were received after the AP call and after having viewed the AP draft report. Thank you.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to make a comment that I had a call from an AP member, and he was kind of concerned about having this meeting with no technical committee report. So I guess this meeting took place before the technical committee was done and had finished their report. So I hope in the future that we're able to coordinate so that APs can have the benefit of the technical committee reports.
Just to quick response to that. So the technical committee did meet prior to the AP, but the report, the draft report of the TC was still in development. So I gave as much insight from the TC's discussion as I could at that time, but you're correct, the report had not been released yet, and so there was no formal report for the AP to review.
Pat, then Eric.
Mr. Chairman, I think my comments are going to cross over both AP and law enforcement and get into angler behavior. Would you like me to hold those, or does she, I mean, it's going to, it's a little bit of all of the above than my rattling through my brain right now.
Why don't we hold off? Okay. We will begin an omnibus discussion soon. Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is about one of the AP recommendations, or not, a comment the AP made about treble hooks and probably double hooks as well. Since Maryland's proposal really only talks about what the bait fishermen will use, and I'm assuming it's natural bait, not artificial bait, has there been any discussion about banning treble hooks in the fishery in total, including jig fishing and everything else? I mean, to me, the treble hook is a real problem. Circle hooks and angular behavior aren't really going to match up, but you know, there's going to be a component of that fishery that's going to use a treble hook because they're using jigs or whatever. Is there any conversation about not allowing that?
At the board level, I haven't heard much. I know there's a piece in there in Amendment 6 that through an addendum process we could address that question. Certainly at the AP call, it was brought up a lot, you know, so amongst those industry members, it's certainly on their plate.
Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll just speak directly to the question. we were to go forward with this option as we're discussing, it would eliminate a treble hook from being used with anything non-artificial, but we have not discussed jig fishing and other forms of artificial lures and removing treble hooks. So the information that we have to base that on is that there's just far less deep hooking and gut hook. The mortality is far less with an artificial lure. That's just what's been communicated to us from our stakeholders.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to go a little further in addressing Eric's question, there's a really big difference between fishing bait on a treble hook and fishing a plug with a treble hook. If it's not obvious, the difference is that that fish ingests that bait. It kind of swipes at a plug or a jig with a treble hook. So discard mortality, in my anecdotal experience, is far lower. And there are certainly a lot of plugs that you can't put J hooks on. They just don't work. So that would be my response to that.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I doesn't want me to say what I want. Yeah, I respectfully disagree with John. I mean, whether the effectiveness with a J hook or a treble hook on a plug reduces the efficiency of the plug is not in question here. What we're trying to reduce is discards. I spent plenty of time on charter boats when I was much younger than I am now, and the first thing we did was take the treble hooks off because we didn't want to get them in our hands. So the question is, can you get rid of treble hooks in the fishery? And if the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, okay.
Okay. That may be an issue this board wants to take up at a later date. I'd prefer it at least 2 years from now. But we can do that. Any other questions for any of the boards here, the committees? Adam, do you want to speak to your points?
You're still entertaining a TC-specific question as well?
Yeah, I think we can begin that discussion now.
So I find it very fortuitous, first, that this board meeting was preceded earlier today by our strategic planning discussion, and while they weren't explicitly on the agenda, we had our mission happen to come up, which states promoting cooperative management to avoid physical waste, and yet that's exactly the reason why we're here today and why Maryland has brought this proposal forward specifically to do that, avoid this physical waste. My specific TC-related question is that on page 2 of their document, they cited that a number of the proposals they considered conservationally equivalent to the current regulations, and that made me wonder, had these proposals come forward a number of years ago when we were addressing the addendum for changes that were required, would these proposals have passed muster and been approved had they come forth at that time?
They would not have, because they could not have demonstrated a 20.5% reduction relative to 2012. So they didn't meet none of what they, it's hard to say for sure, but none of what they showed us indicated that it would have reduced harvest relative to 2012, which was in the plan, and that's what was required. So because the regulations that we put into place with this 18-inch did not actually result in the reduction of harvest that we had expected, in part because of that large year class coming through, you got a higher harvest. They didn't, those regulations didn't work out, which is why you can have a minimal change from current regulations in terms of removals, which the TC does feel is legit, but not a reduction relative to 2012, which is what's mandated in the plan.
So I'm just trying to understand. It was my thought that we're saying that they don't meet the 20.5% reduction based on information we've gathered since we put those measures in place, is my understanding. And we would not have had that information 2.5 years ago, and as such, we would have deemed them, as the TC says, conservationally equivalent. At that time, we approved it then. Why would we not have approved these new measures then?
So I think the other issue is that, I mean, they didn't use the same set of years that we were using at the same time. So whether or not this analysis would have showed something different, I can't say if they had been using this wider set of years compared to the 3 years that everybody else used during the conservation equivalency program. But I find it extremely hard to believe that Maryland would have come to us proposing 18 inches when they could have gotten away with 19 inches. So I think using the data that they had at the time, it indicated that 19 inches was not going to get you the reduction that you needed. So whether it's this different set of data, whether it's they did not include the most recent couple of years, so we can't say anything really about the influence of that 2015 year class. And if you had, the 2011 year class, if you had included that data, would this proposal look differently? We can't say relative to that. So I think the issue is really that the management plan, Addendum 4, because it doesn't have specific regulations in place, it opens up this sort of gray area in terms of how you're interpreting the results. And that had the 18 inches been written into the plan, even though, the 20 inches have been written into the plan, if they had come to us and said, we're demonstrating that current regulations, the 20 inches, there's no change, we would have said, yes, that's conservationally equivalent, and that's equivalent to what's in the plan, so we're good to go. But that's not what's in the plan, and that's why we're kicking it to the board for that question of how you're interpreting conservation equivalency.
Okay. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while we're speaking about the plan, maybe I could ask you your thoughts on the objectives of that plan. It was clear, in my understanding, that one of the objectives was to reduce fishing mortality to the target within a period of time. Another objective was to protect, to the practical extent possible, the 2011 year class. Those were two pieces to that plan that I believe we have accomplished. The last assessment indicated that fishing mortality on a coast-wide basis was below the target level by 10%, and the 2011 year class is really out of the bay at this point. So I would maybe I'll just make the comment that the plan, when I look back at that plan and working through that plan, I don't think it was ever anybody's expectation that we would maintain some form of a constant harvest strategy while we have the influence of year class strengths that we do. And it would suggest to me that this conversation about finding or maintaining a harvest level at or below the 2012 harvest was it wasn't something that was going to happen. We had a 2011 year class expanding in the bay to the degree that it did. And while we may not have met the letter of the plan, I believe that our potential harvest was reduced dramatically as a result of those increases that we took. I think we all made a really solid, good faith effort in putting together the regulations that we did as a result of Addendum 4. And I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
So we've segued into exactly the spot I'd like to be. Frames the question we need to begin with. Conservation equivalency, are we measuring it against the minus 20.5% or against what was actually achieved by the rules that were put in by Maryland in good faith? So do we consider that water over the dam, or do we go back to that? And if we go back to that, they will not achieve anywhere close to conservation equivalency. So that I'd like to discuss that, because that's really a non-starter to go forward unless we have some consensus on that. Doug.
So give you my thoughts on that if you give me a chance to ask my original question.
No, Doug.
Okay, sorry. All right. So,
please.
If you might, if I can ask the question first, and then I'll give you my thoughts on which standard that we need to apply it to. And the question is for Mike. In our conservation equivalency guidance document for state proposals, state conservation equivalency proposals, one of the things that we ask for in the proposals is that they include a plan describing the monitoring schedule, reporting requirements, and documentation of the process of evaluating the impacts of the conservation equivalency measures. And I've always taken this as evaluating it after we put it in place. If we were to approve this, I didn't see anything in the proposal stating what your mechanisms for providing information to evaluate whether it actually accomplished the goals that you had put forward.
If I can ever get off the hot seat and get to the motion that I drafted a couple hours ago, I think it'll answer your question. Part of our plan would be, if this were to be adopted by the board, that we would work throughout this upcoming year to provide law enforcement, compliance, and other necessary data that we could discuss with members of the Charter Boat Association and our folks that are collecting information on APIS. There's certainly avenues that we can take to put forth a report that we would bring back to the board so that we can understand. It's an accountability on our part as well. We will learn from a report like that or from a data collection practice, where we might be not hitting the mark, and that would give us an opportunity to reach for that mark in a better way.
Okay, I appreciate that, although at least according to our guidance, we're supposed to have that information during the proposal period. So, but that's great to hear that you have that plan, and I hope it'll come, if we approve this, that process is going to be outlined in maybe by the next meeting. Now to my thoughts on which standard we need to apply to. From my personal perspective, we knew last year that according to the technical committee's analysis of whether we had achieved our reduction, that in the overall coast-wide, we had achieved that reduction. But we also knew that in the Chesapeake Bay area, there'd actually been an increase. Yet this board at that time, a year ago, did not try to implement some management action to try and get the Chesapeake Bay states to actually achieve a 20.5% reduction. So to me, I think the board made a decision a year ago, and again, this is just my personal opinion, that what had been accomplished coast-wide was good enough, regardless of whether most of the conservation benefit came out of the coastal states.
Thank you, Doug. Mike, were you, okay. Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm responding to your question. So if anyone would like to listen to the 8.5-hour tape of the meeting that decided what Addendum 4 was going to look like, I think they would find out that the intent was, as we heard from someone in the public today, was not supposed to extend this long. So I understand what Doug is saying. I also understand that, you know, things probably been better on the coast for the most part with the movement out of the 2011 year class. But the intent was for most people going through that there were talks of, well, 1 year, we'll get it done in 1 year. The reality was 3 years. A lot of talk about, well, this will take about 3 years. If you remember how the options were, it depended how you did your options when you would reduce F to the target. 3 years was the max. We've passed the 3 years. We are supposed to be talking about cooperation a lot today, so if we are below the target, although somewhat below, not a lot below, but that's the last report we have, we know we have an assessment coming up, which is a little bit of assurance for anything that goes forward, but really we do need to start working on not being hemmed in by Addendum 4. And I imagine if I had Addendum 4 in front of me, it would probably not have an exit strategy. I think that's one of the problems. It may not have an exit strategy. Regardless, we've always had the ability to have adaptive management and conservation equivalency, so we need to start thinking about that. And, you know, so you can probably understand that I'm thinking we do need to do what Mike had said in one of his comments. We're following year classes. 18 years in Chesapeake Bay, we had a cooperative agreement with all the jurisdictions. That was taken out by Addendum 4, no longer exists. And the basis for our management was exploitable biomass, but also that depended on the year classes. So I think we're kind of static here. I think we have enough to be comfortable about a proposal that isn't asking for, you know, the moon. It's asking to trade some discards for harvest. So, and I mean, this is going to be a big issue for us going forward as far as how we treat these proposals. So I think we do sort of say, despite the fact that the coastal states did contribute more to the reduction in F, nonetheless, that reduction has happened. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. John, your forbearance just for a second. Max wanted to comment on that.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple points of clarification. I've heard this brought up a lot over the last few speakers. So there's two different kind of timelines being talked about. One was in regards to reducing fishing mortality below the target, and that is specified in the plan. The target for that reduced rate was by 2016. So I think that's one timeline that's mentioned in the addendum. But regarding the regulations themselves, there's no sunset provision written in there. So, you know, just making those 2 points clear. And then another, just to bring it up, the board did initiate an addendum early last year, talking about relaxing regulations across the coast, and the outcome of that process was that it would hold off on altering the management program until after the results of the 2018 benchmark. So just refreshing the board's minds about that experience.
Thank you, Max. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been going back and forth on this with myself, not with anybody else, because it makes me a little uncomfortable that this conservation equivalency proposal is not compliant with Addendum 4. But if we're going to go back and require Maryland to be compliant, then we're looking at changing their current regulations in a way that would likely be pretty catastrophic to industry, if I understand their concerns correctly. And I don't think that was the intent of the board when we had the information presented to us in November of 2016. I don't think that's the intent of the board now. Really, the way I look at this is we have a choice between status quo and between having a proposal that will be conservationally equivalent and will require a gear use that's been proven over and over again to reduce discards. And I think just intuitively, regardless of whether this is a wash, I think on the water, there is going to be conservation benefit. And so right now, I support the proposal.
Thank you. Pat? Well, Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The state of Maine instituted circle hook requirements several years ago. The Law Enforcement Committee, what the Law Enforcement Committee expressed is exactly what we've seen on the water in the state of Maine. It is sometimes difficult to enforce. Maine Marine Patrol does a lot of work associated with angler education in order to ensure we have compliance. We've not written a lot of cases in regards to circle hooks. Frankly, we still have conflict in the state or disagreement in the state whether we should maintain the circle hook regulations, but I think overall we certainly, regardless of the conflict in the disagreement, overall we certainly have lower discards, so we'll be expecting a lower link limit now, of course, just in jest, Mr. Chairman. But my question to Mike is really, it revolves around angler behavior. In the last several striped bass board meetings, we've had members of the charter boat fleet come up and say, we catch our fish and we bring our clients home. We don't continue to catch and release, which is a foreign concept to me, somebody who ran a charter boat for 8 years and caught and released, many fish every day. So I'm just wondering if I could hear from Mike kind of what is the culture on the water with the charter boat fleet? Do they catch, retain and go home after an hour if they paid for a 6-hour trip? So I'm still trying to get an idea regard to how the overall benefit of this is going to work. And I think, lastly, I just want to echo John McMurray. There is a benefit here, and Adam touched on it, the issue of waste. I mean, I'm leaning towards supporting this proposal because of those two things, with the direct understanding of the challenges from an enforcement standpoint. But with a caveat that I'm not going to support anything that has offset circle hooks included in it. They should be an inline circle hook. And I'll just quickly read the state's definition. The state's definition is the point of the hook has to be 90 degrees to the shank and may not be offset. It's a very simple definition that does work for us from an enforcement standpoint. But I would like to hear from Mike on angler behavior.
Thanks, Pat. Mike?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So we've learned more about behavior in the past few years as charter boat captains have had to make adjustments for these increases in size limit, and culling through the fish that they have to in order to provide for their clients has been, it's been an issue. We continually get told, and again, I'll speak for the charter boat captains, private anglers are a little different beast, but the Charter Boat Association continues to tell us that if they do catch their fish for their clients and they have more time left on their trip, they'll go do something else. They're not going to stay on a school of striped bass and just catch and release. They're going to move to bottom fishing, or they decide to just go home. It's different from an 8-hour trip that's chartered and you're out there for 8 hours and not a minute more. It's just a different mentality. It's a different culture. And what's happened as a result of the changes we made a few years ago is that charter boat operators have had to stay out much longer and cull through hundreds of fish in order to catch a few to bring home to their clients. So we believe that they'll return to that culture more so. And I'll just say that live lining has become a very popular component to charter boat operations, and spot are not cheap. And once you go through the spot that you need to use in order to catch striped bass, the idea is that we're going to save those for tomorrow's, to save the rest for tomorrow's trip and go find something else to do. Hope that answered your question, Pat.
Go ahead, Pat.
I think, and this won't come as a surprise to Mike because we chatted about it briefly, but herein lies the enforcement problems associated with the use of circle hooks when you shift to another species that doesn't require circle hooks. So I think Maryland's going to have to really do their due diligence associated with the other fisheries associated in those areas. And I think based on conversations with Mike, not to put him on the spot, they have ideas in this regard to headwater fisheries and other areas. But it creates a challenge, but it's not something that can't be overcome.
Mike, I think this is a good moment to focus the discussion, and why don't you put out a motion?
I provided it to Max just a bit ago. Okay, so I'll read the motion. Move to approve option B in Maryland's conservation equivalency proposal for its summer-fall recreational striped bass fishery in the Chesapeake Bay. Season, May 16th to December 15th. Size and bag, 2 fish at 19-inch minimum, with only 1 fish allowed greater than 28 inches. Non-offset circle hooks required when fishing with bait, non-artificial lures. Additionally, Maryland will collect enforcement, compliance, and other relevant information during 2018 and will report back to the board with a conservation equivalency effectiveness review in May 2019. So if I get a second, Mr. Chairman, I can speak more so than what I have already to a few of the details in there.
Thank you. Do we have a second? John Clark. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so I'll just clarify that the season that we're proposing is 5 days less than the current season. Just wanted to put it there for the record. Currently, we have a season that goes till December 20th. The bag and size limit, that's clear enough. There's been some question about circle hooks. You know, I spoke earlier about the need to define a circle hook. We have a current definition, as does the state of Maine. We would look to adding that seasonal period to that current regulation, or perhaps adjusting it for the smaller hooks that are used for bottom fishing. And again, I've already spoken to the report. You know, there's some questions in that report as to what we would be able to supply, but I'm happy to bring back to the board's attention perhaps sometime during the year, you know, to provide a progress update on the report that we would be preparing. Thank you.
You had Marty. Did you still want to speak?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I guess this can fit in at any time. I know Mike was anxious to get that motion out so this discussion could evolve. But I wanted to ask a question, and I guess it would be best posed to Nicole or Katie, if you could, and maybe it would help us understand the magnitude of the problem. So listening to Adam talking about the physical waste, and then listening to Rob talk about that 8.5-hour meeting that we advanced addendum for, with one of the goals to protect that 2011 year class. And as Mike said, that year class has now emigrated into the exploitable range. I'm wondering if Katie or Nicole would be able to quantify. You look at the total removals. Back at that 8.5-hour meeting that Rob talked about, the Bay jurisdictions raised their concerns over discard mortality. I'm just wondering what we learned from the total removals, the percentage of what those discards are now that that 4th biggest year class, the 2011 year class, has moved into the exploitable range. What did we learn from that? And I'll end by saying I listened to Andy Shields talk about the 2015 year class, which is the 8th biggest year class. The 2014s were slightly above average. So the 2015 year class is the 8th biggest average. We don't get these very often. So we have a real opportunity, and I think the question is, do we implement some conservation measures to save some of those fish? So I think it might be of value if Katie or Nicole are able to quantify what percentage of removals, total removals, were discards from the 11s now that they've moved on.
That's a good question, and that's not something we have right at our fingertips. I think that is, actually, that's probably something that will come up as we develop the catch-it age for the assessment coming up. So I think we would agree that definitely part of the reason that the Bay did not achieve the reductions that we expected on paper was because of the strong 2011 year class, which was a strong year class after a number of weak year classes that we based that analysis on. So for sure, they did not achieve the reduction that they expected because in part of this large year class moving through that was suddenly available to the fishery. And so, but however, they probably did, changing that size limit did reduce how much they would have taken compared to taking no changes at all. And I think we would expect a similar situation with the, right now what the assessment says is that it's the 2014 year class is a very strong one. And so they'd be age 1 in 2015 and so on. And so I don't think we've had a chance to see what the 2015 year class numbers look like from the model perspective, but I think the indices suggest it's a good one. And so certainly they will be abundant and available to these fisheries in the Bay, and we'll probably see a similar effect in terms of removals. But I couldn't say what percentage right now of those 2011 year classes, was harvested versus were dead discards versus passed on to the fishery out on the coast.
Okay. John Clark, did you have your hand up?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I to second the proposal, but also okay. I obviously support this. I think that we need to be flexible here, considering that many things have been said already. And in considering the waste, let's just think about all the times we've had fishermen from the Chesapeake come to these meetings asking for relief because there is so much discarding that's been going on. It seems that we kind of set Maryland up for failure almost by holding them to that 2012. I'd say that for the whole Chesapeake. So I think this is a common sense proposal. I think a little bit of flexibility here will probably, as they've said, it won't increase mortality. So I think we're good.
Thank you. Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug's comments earlier about Addendum 4 gives me comfort in being able to support this. The one change I think would be important to make, and I hope might make this without requiring an amendment, is to have the report back to us in February as opposed to May. So if the information he brings to us is far different than what he expects, then we would have the ability to make some adjustments prior to the season beginning. So so I would request that from Mike, that if he's willing to do that. If not, I'll ask for an amendment later.
Do you want to respond to that, Mike?
Yeah, if that's fine. I'm okay, John, if you're okay with that, to changing it to February rather than May. I think we'll be collecting the information throughout the year, and circle hooks aren't, bait fishing doesn't happen after October, but we should be able to have something provided for that board meeting.
Okay. John?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I wanted to address the gear specifically because Patrick brought up that concern in his minority report, in the AP report. So we could certainly define a circle hook, and to some extent we've done that here. But a big part of this is making it readily available, because right now you walk into most tackle shops, at least up by me, and there's a dozen different kinds, dozen different labels that say circle hook on them, and maybe one or two are actually inline circle hooks. So what I'd like to see from Maryland is some sort of plan to make them available, and maybe even consider distributing the hooks yourself, and maybe CCA or some other organization will step up and take that role. But But to me, accessibility is really important because a lot of people aren't going to know what an inline circle hook is, and are not going to know what that means. Thanks.
Thank you. Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There may be no need for my comments since I've yet to hear any opposition to the proposal, but I'll go ahead and quickly make them anyway. I feel it would be consistent on the part of our state to support this proposal because I'll remind the board that a number of years ago we brought forth a proposal for circle hooks for catch and release striped bass fisheries on the spawning grounds of the Delaware Estuary, and those measures were implemented by the Delaware Estuary jurisdictions, not because we had to do that, but because we felt it was a good move conservation-wise. So I feel it would be inconsistent on our part to not support this proposal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you're a new chairman and all of that, but you should give people the first bite of the apple before you go back to, some of the other folks 2 or 3 times. You'll learn as time goes on.
Ouch.
Seriously. I came to this meeting thinking that I probably wouldn't support this proposal that we expected to be brought forth, but I guess I've changed my mind. But listening to all the testimony, would it not be wise after, assuming we approve this and Maryland implements this and comes back and provides us with a report, would we not be remiss in considering an addendum to make this universal throughout the range? We talked this morning about utilization of the resource, and what better utilization could we do if we could eliminate discards throughout the range of the striped bass. So I'll just throw that out, and I think, like I said, I think we might be remiss in not taking that type of action. I don't think we've ever done anything like that about terminal gear, but maybe the time has come for us to consider that. Thank you.
I think you may be right. We will be reviewing the benchmark at that meeting, and there's a potential we'll be moving an amendment forward, which could include the circle hook option. Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick, and it's not necessarily very substantive, but the one concern I have now, it's sort of the second half of the motion as we sort of loop back, and it doesn't imply that this review will go to the technical committee, but I'm cognizant of the fact that they're in a benchmark process, and I think that is potentially the real solution here, is letting them complete the benchmark, get that information, and so I just want to be cognizant of that and not pitch any more work at the technical committee. Let them get through that work first.
Thank you. Michelle, and I apologize, I think I skipped over you. Dennis does not approve of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that it was not at all intentional on your part, so I forgive you. I'm inclined to support this. I'm sympathetic to the discard issues that Maryland is facing. We've had similar discard issues in the South Atlantic that have been brought about by changes in size limits, specifically our black sea bass fisheries south of Cape Hatteras, where we implemented a size limit change for all the right reasons, in order to achieve our rebuilding target. And since then, that size limit has remained in place, and we have had many anglers calling me, calling other council members, upset about the fact that they're having to discard so many fish in order to get a legal size black sea bass. And there's a number of other nuances related to that, and one of those is one of the ones that's been considered here in terms of differential seasonal discard mortality rates. So I think given the analysis that Maryland has put forward and the technical committee's statement that, this doesn't appear to change the total removals, I think I'm comfortable moving forward with this, the way this motion is constructed. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Brian, then Rob, then Eric. Yes, Doug. Oh, well, I've heard from you before. You're at the bottom. Marty.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. My fellow Commissioner Brian from District of Columbia and I conferred over this. So the issue I wanted to bring up to you all for consideration was that I distributed a letter. I understand it was late last week that I sent it to Bob and the staff at ASMFC, and I think you may have just gotten it here when you sat down to the table. But what that letter requests is an opportunity for the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, and I'll let Brian speak for his jurisdiction, the District of Columbia. We are contiguous to Maryland. We have a long history of regulatory consistency with Maryland on our recreational charter striped bass seasons. District does not have a charter season, but they do have a recreational. During the time frame for which this motion is made, I don't wish to further complicate this motion, but if it did meet the board's acceptance in terms of not complicating things too much, that would be desirable for our constituency and our commission. So I guess the question is, if that is appropriate, I'd like to amend this motion to include the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, and my colleague Brian may want to do the same thing.
Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, that is to include both jurisdictions, PRC and the district.
So that's a motion. Do we have a second? Emerson. Why don't we get the motion up first? While they're crafting that, Brian or Marty, you want to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I don't know the definitive date of this regulatory consistency history that has occurred over time, but I'm fairly certain it extends well back into the 1990s and perhaps consistent right from the start when the moratoria in the Chesapeake Bay was lifted in 1990. I'm virtually sure almost from the start, Potomac River Fisheries Commission recreational and charter regulations have been a mirror image of Maryland's. And I can let Brian speak for his jurisdiction. I don't know the timing on that. But again, the intent would be for folks that are transiting from one jurisdiction into another. And it's more often the case for folks emanating from Maryland and then coming back to Maryland than, say, the Northern Neck. But it does happen in both sides of the river. But we do have a lot of transiting going back and forth. And so from a law enforcement perspective, from a stakeholder constituent perspective of confusion between disparate regulations, it's something that we would desire. Thank you.
Okay. There's a lot of moving parts now, but I had Rob, Eric, and Doug. I'm sorry, Brian, did you want to? I had Rob, Eric, Doug that wanted to provide comments before we had this amendment. Do you still want to weigh in, Rob?
Yes, thank you. So concerning the amended motion, I will be abstaining, and I wanted to qualify that. Virginia can't simply say include us. This proposal I've known about this proposal for a while, and it has changed shape. And the original proposal, you know, was to have Maryland go to 19 inches. And I have to be faithful to the Virginia anglers who represent our advisors who do not support this proposal. And it is very lean times in Virginia for about the last 9 years. If you saw the data side by side, you'd probably say, what's going on? So it's been a hard time in Virginia. I think overall the reason to abstain is you may have heard my comments earlier were complimentary of what Maryland was doing and the techniques they had, and that is cooperative. But still, at the same time, you know, this is problematic to not support the motion. So my path is to abstain, stay faithful to the intent of the Virginia fishermen, and I think really just to say it again, somehow the 18 years that were spent with cooperative management in Chesapeake Bay that have been decimated by Addendum 4, somehow for the future that needs to be reinvigorated, because it's not only to the benefit of Chesapeake Bay, it's to the benefit of the coastal states as well. We are in the old language, we're a producer area, the largest producer area. There are others, I'm aware of that. So, you know, really, I've been lamenting the loss of cooperative Chesapeake Bay management ever since 2014. You know, that's another reason to abstain here. It's a little bit of a protest, quite frankly, that we can't really do cooperative management the way we should. So thank you very much.
Eric? Okay. Doug?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I had my opportunity for asking questions. I appreciate that. I'd like to give the opportunity to provide some comments on this. As I mentioned before, I do believe that we should be holding the standard as to what is currently in place as far as the conservational equivalency. And I totally support Maryland's desire to try and get the discards reduced in some manner. When we were originally and doing this through circle hooks seems like a very positive step here. But when we were first provided with this proposal, there were a number of options that they put forward for technical consideration, and they considered it and provided their opinions on it. And until I had a conversation last Friday, I didn't realize that Maryland's constituents had asked them to remove all the proposals that actually ended up with a calculated either neutral or reduction in harvest losses on this. And so personally, I've been struggling with this. I was hoping that we could come to some kind of a compromise, and the definition of compromise is we all don't get what we want. But putting forward just one option here sort of says this is what we're offering and that's it. And I don't think that that's in the spirit of compromising, and I think some of the other proposals in combination with a circle hook would have gotten my full support. So I personally will not support this because of what the TC says about the ability to calculate this, and also knowing that I think they use some positive assumptions here on how many circle hooks, or how many people are using currently using circle hooks in the bay.
Okay, before we kind of focus the discussion on the motion to amend, we need to come to a consensus that we as a board agree that Maryland is going to use the current regulations and or removals rather than going back to the Amendment 4. So Max, could you read
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to clarify, seeing how this discussion's going for staff and for the technical committee, that it's the consensus of the board that Maryland, is using current regulations and/or removals as the basis for conservation equivalency here, not the requirements of Addendum 4. So if this were to pass, sort of opening the doors for other states to submit conservation equivalency proposals using current removals and/or regulations as their basis as well. So for technical committee, for staff to know that going into it would be helpful. Thanks.
Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I should question the validity of this amendment. It seems like it's not germane to the main motion just because they happen geographically to be next door. Shouldn't allow them to piggyback on a proposal submitted by an adjacent jurisdiction. I can understand the proximity and all of that, but I don't think we've ever had something like this where a conservation equivalency has been put forward just by amending a main motion to add that jurisdiction. I'd look for guidance on that.
As do I. But when they gave me this job, they said, I don't have to follow Robert's rules, I follow Mike's rules. So, but I'll confer.
Jay had his hand up over there. I don't know if he has anything really insightful to say or if it's an entirely different issue. My understanding is that by adding PRFC and DC, or let me go the other way. If those two jurisdictions were added to the analysis that Maryland conducted early on in this process, and they had carried through the data from those two additional jurisdictions, I think Mike Luisi and I chatted offline before the meeting, and I think Mike indicated that really adding those jurisdictions would not have affected the conservation impact of circle hooks and the other provisions that are up on the screen right now. So my understanding is that there's sort of a no impact by adding these two jurisdictions, and in fact there might be the value that Marty and Brian brought up, which is the consistency in regulations between jurisdictions. There's less of a patchwork of regulations throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. So that, I can't really comment beyond that. Just some sort of qualitative insights as to what I've heard leading up to the meeting, but it is somewhat unique to have other states or other jurisdictions add on to conservation equivalency, because usually when you add jurisdictions, there's new data sets, and those new data would alter the outcome of the analysis. But my understanding here is that that Mike or Maryland or someone else had done some analysis and they didn't see a significant impact. But that was just what I heard before the meeting.
Okay, I'm not sure that's the issue you're addressing, Dennis, right? Whether it's not about the data, it's about the process. You would propose they should be a standalone. Mike?
I'm not sure what to say. In hindsight, we could have reached out to the two jurisdictions and just added their name to our proposal. Staff have informed me that it would not have changed the analysis in any way. The analysis would have been completely the same, and it provides for that consistency in regulations between the Potomac River that feeds the main stem of the Chesapeake Bay. So I hope this board doesn't find too much more heartburn over this request, and it makes things more simple and more complete for the jurisdictions that are all fishing out of the state of Maryland. I'll just leave it at that. I hope we can move this issue quickly and then get back to the main motion.
Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly understand the issue in regards to, I'm going to let this conversation finish. So So the issue of process, I think, frankly, is a real one. The issue that I was struggling with is the precedent-setting nature that staff brought up. If you remember a couple of years ago, just last year, 2 years ago, the herring section utilized a pilot project dealing with spawning during the days out process for the herring fishery. And as I've been sitting here looking at this and the fact that Maryland, the way the original motion is written, is going to be reporting back on the effectiveness of this. If you remove the fact that it says equivalency and talk about this as a pilot project, it is not precedent setting. And in my mind, this is a pilot project. They're going to report back to the board, and then this board is going to have to make a determination on how we're going to move forward. So from my standpoint, and for the insurance of the commission not to set precedents on this matter, I would view this as a pilot project.
Jay?
Yeah, I wanted to drill in on, get away from the process part of it and drill in on the, Mike, what you said a minute ago, and I just trying to be clear. So did your staff analyze data from these adjacent jurisdictions, and that was what their comment was based on, that it would have no impact? Was it an actual analysis?
It was included in the original analysis because the jurisdictions don't have their own MRIP estimations that come from them. Though the fishermen from Maryland that go into those jurisdictions come back to Maryland and are accounted for in Maryland data. So that's why there would have been no difference in the analysis as it stands.
Okay, we're a little bit frayed now. I want to go back to the consensus. Do we have consensus of the board that it's appropriate to use the current data and regs rather than going back to the actual letter of Amendment 4? Head nods. I don't see grimaces, so I'll say we have consensus. Okay? So going back to Amendment, Marty?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I really don't want to complicate this, but having achieved that consensus, I just want to be clear. Would that consensus also include the existing consistency that has been existed as it extends to seasons? And I just want to be completely out front with this board. So both the district and PRFC, and this regulatory consistency as it applies to minimum size and creel limits, there's a differential in the season length. So in that proposal, in the original motion, the season ends on December the 15th. Both the district and PRFC season runs through the calendar year. And I've discussed this with Maryland, and there was a sense that the consistency doesn't change because the season length doesn't change. But that would be problematic for my constituents if we had to end on the 15th. We do not have an issue with people are not even bait fishing at that time of the year. But I just want to be absolutely clear about this, and if it's a problem, I'll withdraw my amendment if I have to.
Michelle.
Definitely appreciate Marty's clarity on that. So, I mean, my understanding from reading Maryland's proposal is that they specifically removed those 15 days from December from the analysis. Well, okay, but the way they partitioned wave 6 was, was a ratio to remove those 15 days, but it was 5 days. So the PRFC and DC seasons run all the way to the end of the calendar year, so an additional 15 days. So I think that's my point, is that whatever numbers of fish are coming in there are not included in Maryland's analysis. That's the way I read it.
I think it's fairly clear that as written, DC and Potomac River would have to follow exactly those seasons. And we can move forward this amendment or you can withdraw it and come back. Go ahead, Marty.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for that clarification. I have clear guidance from my constituents in my commission. PRFC will withdraw their amendment.
Yes, Dennis.
That amendment does not belong to the makers. It belongs to the board. It's up to the board to dispose of that at this point. Robert's rules.
I think we're clear on this, Dennis. All right, so you're saying we should vote on it? Mike?
Maybe I can make a suggestion. We had this conversation leading into the meeting about the complicated nature of this addition. And I've talked with Marty and Brian about the idea that perhaps we can come back to this as a follow-up action at our next meeting, and we could have some resolution as to how an analysis might be different, or you know, what does it really all mean? And we worked on this at the last minute leading up to this meeting, so you know, that could be a way forward. And then at the May meeting, we take another quick look at the implication of including Potomac River and District of Columbia into the plan.
Okay, I think I see a path. Brian, do you agree with withdrawing?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we will agree with withdrawing.
Okay, that being said, it's the board's approval. Does anyone object to withdrawing this motion to amend? Seeing no objections, the motion to amend is removed. So back to the main motion, just Maryland. More discussion. Are we ready to vote? Pat?
Mr. Chairman, I think we still have the issue of a precedent-setting nature where we should consider this as a pilot program and not a conservation equivalency as defined by our policies. I think it clarifies and addresses the issue that has been raised by staff. And I'd like to see this changed possibly as a friendly amendment to consider this as a pilot project.
Do the makers accept that friendly amendment?
While I understand where Pat's going, I think this board, through the conversation that we just had and the clarification by both Max and you, Mr. Chairman, that it's equivalent. It's equivalent to what our current rules are. It deviates slightly from the direction in Addendum 4, but I don't know what happens if it becomes a pilot. It's not anything I've thought about or considered to this point, and I would just, you know, I'm not certain that I would accept that as a friendly at this point right now. But you know, I also know we're running late, and we've talked about this for quite a while. So maybe I can get some direction as to how it would be any different if it was a pilot versus a regulation where we're going to be reviewing it next year anyway.
Pat.
I think it's now been made clear on the record that this issue has been considered as or discussed as the description of the fact that it is precedent-setting in nature, and that the consideration of a pilot, or looking at this as a pilot, it was discussed, and that may be enough just to have it reflected in the record. But the executive director may want to weigh in.
Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, in addition to what Pat said, I think one of the important parts of the conservation equivalency process to remember is that once regulations have been in place for a year, there's the board has the obligation really to go back, review those regulations, and determine if they did or didn't have the achieved or desired effect or expected effect. So I think, given the conversation that's already on the record and this sort of review provision of conservation equivalency, we're probably going to achieve that. There is some unknowns here as far as the benefits of circle hooks and what the public's acceptance is going to be of circle hooks, et cetera. But if we, if Maryland's going to collect some data and bring that back at the February meeting, I think that's the sort of pilot nature of this is built into that process.
Thank you. I think it's time to move the question. Doug?
Just my question about this being a pilot nature. So let's, I always think of a pilot as something you're going to try for 1 year and then evaluate whether to approve to move things forward to a more long-term basis. I guess my question to the executive director under this concept that this is a pilot, would this, if we approve this and in February the information that Maryland brings back to report back to us on the effectiveness of this, if we find that it was not as effective as we had envisioned with this, could the board take action without any kind of a proposal or sunsetting provision that Maryland would have to go back to 20 inches or come up with some other proposal that would reduce the discard mortality while not increasing their harvest? If it's a pilot, does it end at the end of 2018 without some kind of further board action?
Well, I think Mike Luisi stated earlier that he wanted this to not be a one-year program and wanted to carry on for multiple years if it had the desired effect. And I think, that review that will take place a year from now, the board's going to have to decide where they want to go at that point. It will be hopefully clear whether this program did or did not have the desired effect, and at that point the board's going to have to decide where to go. And I don't know what's that's going to be, but also keep in mind that at that same meeting, the board hopefully will be presented with the next benchmark assessment and the results of that, and a new read on the stock, where we are with biomass and F rates and everything else. And the board may also at that time consider initiating another management action. I don't know what that may look like, but to react to that new stock assessment information. So I think there's going to be a lot of moving parts next February, a year from now, on striped bass, and the board's going to have to decide where to go at that point. But assuming this works as it is, based on Mike Luisi's comments earlier, I think Maryland's intention or hope is that this would be able to carry forward.
Okay. David, I ignored you for a while.
My guidance to you, Mr. Chairman, is to ignore Mr. Abbott, except when he agrees with everything you're saying. Having been flapping my arm for an hour, I've exhausted myself.
I've achieved it then.
Completely forgotten what I wanted to say. Now, a little levity is always good in these moments. My only suggestion here is, in just listening to the debate, I actually like the idea of doing this as a pilot, and I would vote to support it as a pilot. I've spoken a number of times about the need to get on with reducing discards in this fishery, and in fact, if you look at the minutes on page 6, there was an exchange between myself and the prior chairman on this, and I think this is a good way to do it. Maryland should be commended for bringing the proposal forward, but the big distinction to me between conservation equivalency and a pilot is that a pilot would be just for Maryland to test this, and as everyone has already stated. Then we're going to review a broader amount of issues, the benchmark stock assessment and a number of other considerations, and we can consider at that point, based on the results, whether or not we want to expand it. If we do it as a conservation equivalency proposal, to whatever extent it sets a precedent for other states, they could follow. So I think that, to me, is a distinction. I would be more comfortable with it as a pilot.
Final word, Dennis.
I really thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we didn't label this as a pilot, and Bob says we can look at it next year, by what method would we, if we didn't like what we were seeing, what would be involved in rescinding this action? Question for Bob.
I think it would have to be a charge from this board back to the state of Maryland, sort of indicating this doesn't work. It has not achieved what the board had hoped, and a charge to Maryland to bring back a new proposal that does achieve an equivalent suite of measures relative to what they have in place right now. So I think it would be a charge back to the state of Maryland to sort of go back, do some more math, and try again.
Follow up on that, Bob. That being the case, they come in next February, for example, and they tell us, oh, we don't like it at that board meeting. Then in May, we talk about it, and they set their regulations for next year. So the 1 year essentially is going to be an automatic 2 years. Not saying that's going to happen, but that's why I would rather see in the motion that it's a 1 year, and then we can vote next year to make it permanent.
Yes. Really the final word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to see that we're actually stepping outside the box. I know that there is legalities involved anytime we pilot projects, precedents, things of that nature. I really could care less which one it's called as long as it's the right one, and I'm sure somebody somewhere is going to get us in line. But between -1% and 6%, I think it's time to vote. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So do I. It's time to vote. Let's take a 3-minute break to caucus. Is everyone prepared to vote?
Can I ask if there's opposition first?
Can I ask for a roll call, Mr. Chairman?
So be it. Richie has asked that, Bob, you put on the record the fact that we can readdress this in February.
Yeah, I think what Richie may be looking for is sort of a comment on the conservation equivalency process. And the way it is supposed to work by letter of the law or letter of the process is that states implement regulations, monitor the impacts of those regulations, harvest level, use of circle hooks, whatever it may be, and then bring that information back. And then the board decides whether that program can continue, or they have to revert back to their previous regulations, or submit a new suite of regulations that achieve the original intent of what was proposed in their conservation equivalency proposal. So the board has that authority in February to monitor what Maryland's done, look at their data, and ask them to revert back to their old regulations if it didn't work, or Maryland can bring forward a different suite of regulations that will achieve the desired effect and equivalency to what they have in place right now. So I think that's what Richie was looking for.
That's right. Okay, thank you. Max, call the roll.
Okay, working north to south. Maine.
Yes.
New Hampshire.
Yes.
Massachusetts.
Yes.
Rhode Island.
Yes.
Connecticut.
Yes.
New York.
Yes.
New Jersey.
Yes.
Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Delaware.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
District of Columbia.
Yes.
Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
Yes.
Virginia.
Abstain.
North Carolina.
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service.
Yes.
The motion passes, 15 yes, 1 abstention. Moving on. Katie, can you update us on the benchmark assessment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We've been added to the SAW-SARC schedule, which means that our review date has been set, which is going to be November 27th to the 30th of this year. We'll be going through with summer flounder. We are in the process of scheduling our first modeling workshop for sometime in late April, early May. That's going to focus on model development for a new sort of stock-structured and hopefully sex-structured model. We'll be having another modeling workshop or assessment workshop in late summer to focus on incorporating the new MRIP estimates when they become available. The board working group on reference point guidance has gotten together and is in the process of developing a survey that's going to go to the entire board as well as the AP to help give the TC some guidance on what the board wants for this fishery in terms of management goals, management objectives, so that we can develop reference points that meet those goals and objectives. So you guys are all going to see that survey soon, and please take it when you do see it. Otherwise, we continue on schedule.
Any questions for Katie? Any other business before this board? Then I adjourn for the second time.